Hello, it's so nice to see you all. My name is Jessica Zwaan. I'm the COO of a company called Whereby, and I'm really excited to be hosting this panel today at CTO Craft. This is my second time I've been to this event, and I always find it super inspiring and really well organized. So I'm really, really proud to be part of it. Today, I have a really wonderful group of people that I'm presenting with, really just a fantastic spread of the spectrum of what is a first team. So I'm excited to hear what everyone's points of view are. I'm going to allow everyone to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Andy.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. My name's Andy Ayim. I'm a father, a coach, and an angel investor. I've got about 15 startups I've invested in the last 5 years. And I also run a small business called the Angel Investing School that trains others on doing the same. And prior to that, I spent my career mainly as a product manager and then a head of product. So really looking forward to kind of sharing that perspective today when talking about a first team.
Wonderful. Andy and I have known each other for a very long time. I'm very excited to have you on a panel with me today, Andy. Maya, welcome to the panel.
Hi, thank you. I'm a marketing operator. I run a growth consultancy called Marketing Cube, and I work with founders of startups and scale ups on their growth path, both defining them and implementing them. And before that, I kind of worked on with larger tech and smaller tech. In my last in-house role, I was building Pharmacy to You, which we sold to private equity. But like Andy, I've done a fair bit of angel investing now, very focused on female founders, and very much excited to be talking about first teams, because I feel I was spending my life with my CTO back at Pharmacy to You. So.
Absolutely. Well, it's lovely to have you on the panel. I'm really excited about hearing all your perspective. Josh.
Hey, thank you, Jesse. So Josh Knowles, I am an engineering leader who's currently the VP of Strategy, Operations, and Product at Code Climate, which is an engineering management platform supporting CTOs. So strong background in engineering leadership, and now find myself partnered up with our engineering leader as I take on the product strategy and ops responsibility here at Code Climate.
Wonderful, Josh. It's so nice to have you on the panel today. And another connection from way back in my life, Melissa. How are you doing?
I'm great. Hey, everybody. I'm Melissa. I'm currently the VP of People at Farewill, and we are out to change the way the world deals with death. So, doing online wills, probate, direct cremation, all that fun stuff. I've been in the people space for a while. Most recently, I was at another tech startup called Thread, which is in the machine learning business. Before that, I was doing some VC recruitment. And before that, I lived in the US and got my start actually recruiting engineers and working with engineering hiring managers. And so I have quite the soft spot for CTOs and engineering leaders in general.
Wonderful. What a great spread. Like I said, we really have touched every single part of the kind of leadership team. So I'm really excited about hearing everyone's different perspectives today. Um, if you're at home watching this, I just wanted to remind you that you can add your questions at any time in the Ask a Question link below the video. I will be looking at those and answering them. My approach to panels very much is the audience questions prevail. So we've got some pre-prepared things, but the more questions you ask, the more questions we can have answered. So please feel free just to sling them in and we'll pick them up as much as we can. But let's kick off. So what is a first team? I thought it might be a good place to kind of introduce the concepts together. The idea of a first team was best and first really articulated by Patrick Lencioni, who is the writer of a book which I think a lot of people know about called Five Dysfunctions of a Team. And a first team is your fellow leaders. So it really is the peers you have around you that support you while you build the business, that are your strategic kind of partners. But more than that, it's actually the idea beyond just this group of peers around you, but it's the idea of prioritizing those leaders and supporting those leaders in preference for your team and your direct reports, right? And there's a very different kind of frame of mind of how you prioritize what your first team is. So this means your head of product, your VP people, your CMO, and I've got a really great little blog post, which I'll make sure I share on the Slack channel afterwards, that talks a little bit more about the idea of a first team and how you can kind of wrap your head around it. But I think the first good place, well, actually, first question to the panel, is there anything you think I've missed? Feel like that's a decent description of a first team as you understand it? Yeah,
I think
Great job.
cool.
it's the group you build that business with, right? So that's very much, I think, what's at the essence of that is obviously we all have our support network and additional resources that include our own teams functionally, but at the core, this cross-functional team is the kind of, usually the team you can feed with one pizza that is building together the business, and have all the right skills among themselves for that. Not to say that the rest of the team doesn't bring a lot too, but it's kind of a representation of all those different functions. And I think that's where the focus needs to come from, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I would love to throw this one out first to Josh. I think we had some previous conversations about this in our prep. Why have you seen this way of thinking be really beneficial to you and kind of more broadly to other CTOs around the world?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's, when you reach a certain level of scale, there's definitely a better together mentality that you can bring to the organization, and investing in those relationships with your peers is the thing that I've found is most beneficial to doing things greater than the sum of your individual department. It wasn't always the case,
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk about some of those things as we go on when we might have done this differently and why. But in the current role, investing heavily in that first team as the first team has led to some incredibly impactful things.
Yeah. Okay, great. Does anyone have anything else to add to that about why this way of working has been really beneficial for them, maybe in your business or in your history?
Well,
I think
something I would add to that is I think when you don't have that first team mentality, it's really easy to just assume whatever you and your kind of downwards team are working on is the most important thing. And when you actually have that first team view, you better understand the whole gamut of what's happening in the business and can make better decisions overall for like, what does this team need? What does this business need? And then I think that just enables better things overall for everybody. And so I've had experiences where I was part of a company where we were forming our first exec team. And so that was quite difficult because we were all used to being like, our team's first, and like, whatever the people team needs, that's my priority. And then suddenly having to change those priorities and think more as a unit was really hard, but it paid off in gold. Like, it was just so great to see how suddenly we were thinking more long term, we were thinking more strategically, we were better able to help each other out. Also, it's just less lonely. Like, I just felt like more part of something. I wasn't just sort of trudging along, like building my own thing. And then recently I've joined a team where that existed already, and it was like just so different to come into a place where already there's that mentality. And I felt like we were just much more efficient from my day one anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that point about it feeling less lonely, especially when you're the kind of leader of a function. You really do often feel like you're the kind of pin on the top of the team. Maya, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Mel said there around, you know, thinking longer term, being very much as this first team, having those must-win battles at a cross-functional level, really at corporate venture level, right? Where that allows you to both help each other out because suddenly it's not just functional objectives. Oh, you marketing going to do this and I'm going to do that. It's actually cross-functional teams working together. And the number of times that I had to turn to my CTO because I was like, my Martech stack is a mess. I don't know what I'm doing. Save me. It's not his job, right? But if he knows it's important for our growth in that sense, he'll step in and maybe even educate himself alongside me and help me do a whole bunch of stuff that I would have, completely missed if it wasn't for that function. And that's just one, the CTO example, and there'll be maybe other cross-functional. But it's really this venture level, must-win battles, and then we're all, no matter what our function is, understand how we're delivering to that venture piece, and that again facilitates. Actually, sometimes if that mentality is not there yet, and the CEO or other leaders are trying to implement it, it really starts by this cross-functional must-win battles, and then it kind of unlocks the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, you do a lot of angel investing, as you know, and you're also in touch with a lot of founders, talking to them about leadership. You have a really wonderful newsletter that comes out, often referencing interesting leadership methodologies. Is this something that you encourage, a kind of a frame of thinking to founders and people setting up their own leadership teams around them?
Absolutely. I think, I had parents' evening tonight with my daughter, she's 5. And what you notice with kids is that kids often emulate their parents. They don't do what you say, they rather do what you've done. And I think leadership works the same way when you're thinking about your first team. Like as leaders, what we're acting by being a part of this first team is saying that we are responsible for one another and the collective organization success. And in doing that, actually, there's others in the organizations that are in teams that can then mirror that. And that's what shapes culture and the environment. And with a lot of the founders, sometimes some of the friction is around, and of course, I advise a lot on product hires, but it's making that first product hire and realizing
Mm.
actually that I need to hand off some of my baby. And that's actually really difficult for a lot of founders who feel still responsible for it. So, it's how do you create that psychological safety within the team where actually that new PM or that new hire, that new person that you brought into your first team can actually feel vulnerable and safe in challenging or asking questions whilst actually knowing that that will be
Mm.
accepted and embraced. And I think that's often quite difficult when transitioning into that first team, for example, as a new hire or maybe as a manager who had a different frame of reference in representing your team, sticking up for your team in battles, or re-representing the viewpoint of the team that you managed. So I think that shift is often very difficult for founders, but also managers making that transition into the first team.
Yeah, absolutely. You've actually kind of made me think of something here, and Melissa as well. You mentioned that you've had to build out this first team in the past, so that these teams take very different shapes and sizes, and very often they change quite frequently, especially at startups, right? Like at various points, you may actually start segmenting people ops into VP people, PB talent. Maybe you're separating finance out from finance and then data, and you're really starting to segment these teams and bring more leaders in. So I'm interested, how are your current first team set up? Have you got a really large group of peers around you? Do you have a small group of peers? And how do you find it works specifically with your engineering lead in there? Do you have a CTO that works closely with you? We can go around, I think, in the same order as we went in for introduction. So Andy, but we'll throw the hot seat back at you. I know you're largely working independently at the moment, but you have quite a lot of things, irons in the fire. So how do you think about your first team?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I always think about culture and environment, and I want to build trusted teams where people feel like rather than hiding a mistake because of the fear of getting in trouble or them ending up faking it, I want them to instead feel like they can ask for help. And in the position that I'm in, actually, it's quite a challenging one because some people, like someone of influence within my industry. So sometimes they don't feel like they can ask me a question. So I often like actually use really like what I learned from agile teams, actually a few different games to kind of get people settled in, get people feeling comfortable, and actually getting people to get to know me personally before we can actually work together professionally. And this is something that I got from football and being a footballer when I was younger and being a captain of a team. I realized that actually there's so much value in people getting to know you personally because they often go the extra mile for you on the pitch. And I think the same works actually with teams and organizations. Like when you actually have those socials, when you actually go on that training development program and have fun with your team, it brings a different dynamic to you at work professionally. So when we're talking about this aspect of first teams, actually there's different methods and different cadences that we can create to form the relationships that make us feel more like a first team. So it's having the Slack channels, doing the socials, going on training together, having a lunch and teach each other things, like having those vulnerable open sessions where we can really form those bonds so that it becomes a lot easier to get on the same page and making decisions or helping each other out when it's needed.
I really love that there's like a big spread of different ways that you approach first team. Um, Maya, how does your team currently is it structured? Who do you consider these peers that you work with on a daily basis, and do you or have you worked with a CTO closely in the past?
Yeah. Yeah. So at Pharmacy to You, definitely worked very closely with our CTO. We had this slightly unusual structure where front end experience was sitting with me as well as this like sense of true growth
Mm.
marketing or full funnel. So you can imagine how much I had to deal with him a lot because I had to connect kind of the front end to the back end, right? Through my CTO. So yeah, definitely worked really closely. To answer the beginning of your question, today, I call Marketing Cube my and friends. And again, it's a very cross-functional team. It's designers, brand designers, UX designer, long content form, conversion copy, SEO experts, leads build, a kind of list building experts for lead generations and things like that. So I very much considered them as my first team, because while we don't all intervene on all the clients I'm working with, it's really the people I'm bringing to making this client engagement successful. And so I think that becomes really important. Obviously, we're also an external party to that business as much as we embed ourselves into all the startups we work with. And so I think it's a much better experience to the actual recipient at that point, which is this cross-functional team in the business, and actually mimicking some of that. Because a lot of our engagements are all about, building growth, right? And growth is not all about marketing. It's actually very cross-functional. And it was interesting to hear Andy talk about, that's kind of how you bring that example back in. And I think they look at how we engage, and we help them kind of build something similar internally as a cross-functional growth team. So that becomes really important. I think as when it comes to marketing and tech, and again, no matter where you put that divide between who owns your front end, who can make changes to the website, how do you do all your conversion optimization on the site, at the end of the day, you're going to have to engage with tech one way or the other, right? Even UX might be sitting with your CTO group, etc. And so for me, it's like I very much take this growth funnel view of saying, okay, we might be the one generating interest, etc. But then at some point, I need tech to continue influencing my funnel all the way to customer service eventually, right? To make sure that all that I brought in are really kind of not only through ops, but customer service, all those customers we spend so much time acquiring and optimizing that they don't get lost because something went wrong there, and really looking at that full funnel. And so I kind of started with tech, which sits somewhere in the middle of that funnel for me, but it's just to kind of, again, close the loop for the full first team, depending on your business, of course.
Wow. Okay. So it's you have a very different approach than I think the people that we're working in house, and probably what Josh said. In your introduction, you introduced yourself as saying that you work very closely with your CTO today. So how is your first team structured, Josh?
Yeah. So for context, Code Climate we're about 100 people, Series C startup, and so our leadership team that I'm part of. So I help represent the product and strategy. I partner very closely with our VP of engineering, but the rest of our first team is filled out with our head of marketing, our head of sales, head of finance, and our head of people. So we're actually in a leadership offsite over the next couple of days, and so that's the 6 of us around the table who are going and thinking about and planning for next year together.
Yeah, perfect. And Melissa, finally, how's your team structured at Farewill?
So there's 5 of us in the exec team, or what I'd call my first team. And I think one of the things that I feel that we've done really well since when I joined is it actually is the first team. So even on my first day, it was, hey, come to breakfast with us. It wasn't, oh, come meet the people team right away. Like, we have an end of week check-in together. We have the standard exec meeting every week, but we're just constantly talking. I think we have a very healthy culture of just calling each other, being in touch, there's just a lot of communication flow. It's interesting because I actually sometimes have moments where I'm like, ooh, am I even thinking about my first team too much? Like, am I present enough with the people that I am leading? And so that's just been a really interesting thing for me to navigate over the last couple of months, as I only joined back in May. In terms of my relationship with our VP of engineering, and this also extends back to my last role where I was very close with our CTO as well. I see my role as really understanding their role and understanding their team, their challenges, what they're actually building, and being as close in there with them as possible. And I think any of us who've been in that people role know, like Jess, I know you know this, like, we end up wearing a lot of different hats, from kind of like therapist and coach to like ruthless problem solver to recruiter to like just general Sherpa. Like, there's just so many different hats. And I think the key is just finding that way to stay together And so that's the thing I think we
Yeah.
do well, is we have that great kind of connection and communication flow.
That's actually a really nice segue into a question we had from the audience from a person called Dave. So hello, Dave. And this is a question that I also wanted to know the answer to, and I've written down. So we'll cut straight to it. When you have so much going on, Melissa, like you have, and you're wearing all these hats internally, and you're wondering, maybe I'm spending too much time with my internal first team. What do you do when tensions start rising and you're struggling to figure out, like, what is best for the business, what is versus what's best for the team, and kind of handling those priorities? And Dave's given a really good example here. Is like, how can a head of support think about bugs being more important than anything, or a head of sales championing a new product, for example? There's some very clear priorities there. How do you kind of come together to handle those tensions, and make the best decision for the business?
Yeah, sorry, I think this was to me. Did you say?
Yeah, it was to you. It was to you.
So I think it often comes back to having a really clear shared alignment on what is most important to us now, in terms of whether it's OKRs or core metrics or whatever it is that you use to keep the business intact. Being able to refer to something like that is important. Likewise, having things like values, having philosophies, just anything you can grab onto that dictates, like, this is what is most important to us as a business, like as a unit right now. And these are the kind of ways in which we think about what's important. And then I think it's actually just about having that kind of very open conversation, which is, okay, this is a thing. We know we need to help, like, this problem. Here's what's on my plate. Here's what's on your plate. Like, here's everything that's going on. Like, if we have to, let's stack rank. Like, let's talk about it. Let's have a good conversation to figure out what actually is the priority overall, and what can we push aside, or what can we delegate, what can we wait for next week. And it's hard, but I think just being able to have that kind of conversation where it's not personal, like I think that's the key, is it's not like my stuff versus your stuff, and are we prioritizing mine or yours. It's our stuff. And so collectively, here's all the different things we could be doing. How are we going to decide where to focus? So it's not easy, but I think the better you get at having what feel at first like quite labored conversations, it's actually like slowing down to speed up in the future. It'll just become much more instinctual.
Amazing. Josh, have you got something to add? I can see you nodding away over there.
Yeah, no, I plus one everything Melissa said. We spent the last day as a leadership team getting out of the tactical weeds and really thinking about, what are we going to look like in the end of 2025? Right, so 3 years from now, where is the organization going to be? What aspirations do we have? What does the product strategy look like to support that? And now we're working backwards from there and saying, amazing, we all buy into that vision. Now, if you work backwards very tactically, as we think about the headcount constraints that we might have, in this market, or we think about, where to prioritize, the limited time that we all have, is it helping us make progression towards that 2025 vision? And if so, then it shouldn't be a debate, right? We all agreed that was the right vision. So if we need to go hire a marketing colleague ahead of an engineer, right, because marketing and top of funnels is important to us, then that should be, there should be no debate there. And so aligning on that 2025 vision, and then working backwards and being able to associate every tactical decision back to that is something that's been super helpful for us.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of add the very practical layer beyond that. If you get to a whole list, right, of everything that is indeed aligned to your 2025 or whatever more vision plans you have, I mean, at the end of the day, it's important versus urgent, and the impact level of not handling this most immediately versus slightly later. And also, I think we just need to be really creative about, it's all, it's money and time, right? At the end of the day, it's like, we can't handle all three in one go, so we're going to have to do it in a specific order. It's just being really creative about resources and who can actually do that. Does it actually require an engineer or an SQL guy or whatever that might be? And also, I mean, we really live in such a decentralized, remote, freelancing world environment, and Fiverr, Upwork, and anyone else, and I'm advertising them because I use them and I think they're great. There's so many ways to just get some stuff done, and for not that much more, and very quickly. And so often also just looking at this and saying what could just be outsourced so we don't have spend another hour prioritizing it, right? Because that's also part of that, time spent on this, that we all could be doing something else if we could resolve it immediately. And so I always invite the teams of saying, like, what is the MVP on this? Who do we really need on that? And where can we find them within the budget constraint we might have? And leave the internal team do the longer term, thinking deep work, as opposed to like try to clean up through a whole bunch of stuff that is really bothering everyone or slowing us down.
Andy, you come from a product background. So one of my favorite articles in the world is an article by Brandon Chu called Ruthless Prioritization. Like, I feel like product managers have so much to teach us about how to prioritize. What's your feelings on this? How do you approach prioritization inside of a business?
I'm going to go back to when I was at Zilch and I joined as head of product. And at the time, there was Series A startup, and then it grew to Series C. And for context, what that really means is that they've grown really fast to this stage called Series A, where actually you've inherited like really rushed code. Like, we did what we had to do with a very slim team that were kind of junior and mid-level to get to where we're getting to. So often there's this friction where the leadership team would want to like accelerate revenue growth, acquire customers, and focus on growing into new regions, whilst the technology leaders like the CTOs thinking about actually like, how stable is our infrastructure? Like, actually, we've got tech debt that we need to address. And what was really helpful for us is really thinking about opportunity cost and trade-offs. And often it isn't as linear as we're going to do this and then that. But often we'll do something like a pre-mortem exercise to say, all right, in 3 months' time, if we don't address this technical debt, actually, what's going to occur and how's that going to impact us? How's that going to impact release management? How's that going to impact the quality of the code? How's that even going to impact the enjoyment from the engineers on working on this, right? Because they're the ones that are actually in the weeds. And we often got to a negotiated position where we're saying, we're going to dedicate 30% of the next 4 sprints to technical debt on these specific areas. And that was often like the middle ground that worked, because yes, we were still making progress towards, let's say, our 2025 goal. But the truth is, similar to what we've seen in the markets over the last 2 years, there's so much ambiguity when you're building a startup, and the landscape changes so frequently that you do have to adapt, unfortunately, to those changes as they're occurring. So there's often some sort of trade-off that we're going to have to make to negotiate and make both parties happy, even though it's not an ideal solution for each.
Yeah, I really love that description that you gave there. I think that was kind of like the perfect description of why a first team is so important, right? Like, there's all these discussions happening around stability, revenue, the happiness of the team, and that's the people side of things as well really needs to be thought about, and sometimes that does slip. And then also just like the operating capacity, the ability for the team to execute. And if we're changing priorities all the time, how do we keep organizational clarity in mind? That is, like, I think, such a great way to describe why you need these different types of heads in these conversations. Otherwise, you'll end up kind of defaulting one way or another. One of the challenges, though, is if you have these different types of people with very different approaches of dealing with things, and I think we just had a nice little spectrum of different ways to approach tensions anyway from our different backgrounds, right? Is that we need different things from our first team. Not only just as a professional, but also kind of as a personality archetype or a way of approaching things. And one of the questions here, I think, has touched on a good point in the bigger picture of what we need from each other, which is, how should a CTO be communicating effectively with the rest of the first team, right? So what do you need from your first team? What do they need from you? And maybe, like, is that different for different types of roles? Do you have a different way of approaching it when you're dealing with your CTO versus when you're dealing with your CMO? See, Maya's like, that's me. How are you thinking about it when it comes to the different types of people you're interacting with in that first team to do it effectively? Anyone want to grab that one? Feel free just to duck in. Maya, go ahead.
I'd love to kick this one off.
Go ahead, Andy, absolutely.
I feel like product often operates at the intersection of like customers, technologists, and the rest of the business. And I hate using that terminology actually because it also often creates silos by using that language in itself. Like the business is separate from the technologists when we're all in the same business as it is. But what we have to get really good at sometimes as product leaders is reframing the language so that it makes sense for the business goals that we're trying to achieve. So often when I used to speak to CTOs and they might go into depth on features or technical things that they're working on, and then we have to reframe that to understand actually what problem are we solving and how does it help us in terms of moving the metric that we care about. And often that's the level at which it moves from opinions to actually we can understand the value of this impact, we understand the value of this work. And getting to that layer often with leaders helps us to actually feel like, all right, now I see how we're working together to achieve this goal. Because it often is actually a cross-functional effort. Like we need the technical teams to work with product managers and with designers to create this thing, but then the marketing team needs to create something to market, and then the sales team needs to sell it to. So often actually like we're connected in what we're doing, and we need to get on the same page in terms of understanding what are we working on within our teams and how does it layer up actually to the impacts and the outcome that we're trying to achieve. So I often talk about outcomes over outputs. And I think that's a language that really helps to get us aligned when working on things as a leadership team.
Andy, you'd make a perfect marketer. I feel like I spend my life telling marketing teams, "What's the outcome? Don't give me the feature." But yeah, could not agree more with what you said there. I kind of picked up this concept from my Google days, and I'm sure other people use it too. But it's like for technology, but many other departments too, but specifically technology, fix the plumbing, add value, go for glory. And so suddenly, if you can actually call out, right, the fix the plumbing, like I can carry on building your features, it's going to crash. So unless you give me this space to do that, all the rest will never happen. And so at some point, obviously, you get to a point where fix the plumbing is really minor, but at a Series A fast growth company, it's actually really, really long list that needs to be prioritized or outsourced or somehow dedicated resources for a time on. So I always invite my CTOs to be like, talk to me in 3 buckets. What are your 3 buckets, right? And obviously, usually with marketing, they'll be, or on growth, they'll be focused on add value, maybe even going for glory if we're building some magnificent product-led growth, engine. So those are the things that I usually invite my CTO partners to focus on, so that, please don't send me to a list of tickets in Jira. I'm definitely not going to get it.
I think this is a nice segue to something that Josh and I had spoken about before we came to here, which is what are the times where you have a story where you've maybe misprioritized or a wrong decision's been made, and you've had to really trigger this mindset either once and for all, or just you realize you've slipped out of it. Josh, I think you had a good story for us. What was your history of that happening?
Yeah, we talk about this like it's easy, but many of us don't join an established first team like Melissa was saying. These things emerge over time, and I definitely have made the mistake of focusing on my downline, right, and the team organizationally below me, as opposed to those peers to my left and right. And this definitely affected me when my team was doing incredibly well, and we were celebrating our wins. Then maybe it was less of a priority. But the minute that my team needed help from someone else, and I realized that I hadn't made those investments in my relationships with finance or in my relationships with my people team, then all of a sudden I need to go ask for help. And they're like, who are you, right? You haven't been showing up to staff meetings. You haven't been helping us when we need the help. And so all of a sudden, when I need a hand, I hadn't built those personal relationships like Andy talked about. And all of a sudden, I didn't have those folks by my side to give me a hand, right? And that was that light bulb moment for me that encouraged me to treat those peers as my first team, because when things are going well, maybe it's less of a focus point. But when all of a sudden, when things aren't going as well, you need those other senior leaders by your side.
I think we've got Maya's camera's frozen, but if you rejoin us, feel free to duck in. You think you may have had something to add there. I think there's a good, I mean, it's a great example, right? Building these relationships is so important if you want to be able to kind of be able to call upon them, right? And then you kind of presume everything's good until it's not, which is a classic mistake in a fast growing business. And so many businesses that we're working in now and working directly with, we're really seeing them struggle in lots of different ways. Financially, there's a lot of turmoil in the marketplace, and I'm sure we can have a whole other panel about how that's going. But in these moments of crisis, of turmoil, of chaos, of stress, one of the things that I think has been helpful with the hierarchical way of naturally mechanizing teams is it's very easy to hold people accountable, right? Like you're in charge of this team, you're accountable for them. But when you're really starting to have to hold your peers accountable and work together as a team, that can be really difficult in moments of stress. And I've experienced this in my history as well. Um, Maya, you can duck in and answer the thoughts about when you prioritize your team maybe incorrectly, and then feel free just to go straight into it. When have you had an experience, or how do you really focus on holding your fellow peers and your first team accountable when you haven't got that hierarchical structure kind of forcing you to do that?
Yeah, I'll add quickly on what Josh was saying there. Sorry, I had a minute of internet challenges.
Oh,
Was
good.
very, very much around at the core of it, right? We'll set, cross-functional objectives at the core. We'll be really acting, hopefully, as a first team, and then you'll end up getting, the cross-functional team in all the, downlines across the C-level teams or VPs, etc. That maybe get in some kind of element of misalignment, but they didn't get the memo kind of thing, so they're not doing this, etc., etc. The thing is, if you're not aligned and acting as a first team at executive level, then it's just like a minor misunderstanding at that level. It can be cleared up very quickly. You can very much ping your CTO, your CMO, whoever, saying, hey, in the nicest possible way, so seems to have missed that priority. Can you just realign with them so we can unlock X, right? And it's not a matter of like, what's going on? Why are we not aligned? Like it doesn't become a big thing. It becomes just a minor realignment at the right level where it has maybe fallen through. But if you have to redo that alignment from the top down, like this will take weeks, right? And so I think that's a really important one. And just remind me your other question.
How do you hold your leaders accountable when you don't have that kind of hierarchical structure forcing that?
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, and that it can very much depend also on the tone set by your CEO, to be honest, and other kind of, even your investors sometimes. But I find that those moments really happen in those pre-mortem, post-mortems, review of progress in this management meetings, and in saying, you seem to be struggling with this, how do I help you? But also then the return of saying you haven't asked for help and you seem to be over, and it's not happening, what's going on? So I think it's like this duality of first offer to help before you hold them accountable, right? If you can. And I think those are really the places where it happens. And often I've seen the most collegial conversations like that are really led by a CEO example that acknowledges this, like, oh gosh, that was a terrible interview. I totally didn't follow whatever your speaking points. That could have been better. Sorry, kind of things. Like obviously some are more important than others, but I think if you find that vulnerability in whoever is your most senior C-levels, if you like, can really help, because again, even in that management team, especially in startups, there's a unspoken, I guess, seniority angle as well, right? Like I can tell you that my CFO was as good as our CEO, and they were very much that pair with the rest of the management team, and they were very much welcoming us and treating us very well. There's no question, and we were a single team. But if the CEO and the CFO were able to be vulnerable in front of the rest, it was really inviting everyone else to be very acknowledging of their shortcomings, not ideal situations, but also helping each other, if that's what the senior leadership was doing, I guess.
I think extending on that same question, I really I appreciate the mindset of what it feels like to be there, offering help as first step before starting to hold people accountable. And I think that's such a useful perception for a peer coming into that first team. The people team have a really interesting role in this, Melissa, as I'm sure we're going to get into, is the people team are expected to not just be able to kind of offer help and hold each other accountable, but also we're building the structures that actually make our teams give each other feedback and like set expectations. How do you employ that part of your role to make sure that you're able to build a leadership team that's giving each other feedback, holding each other accountable, and operating like a functioning team?
Yeah, it's really hard. So I'll offer a couple different ideas and thoughts of things I've tried over the years and things I think have worked particularly well. So one, I think, is to just try to develop that muscle with each other very early. And so making it clear just
Mm.
from day one that it's actually part of the expectation that as each other's first team and more importantly, as leaders of the business, we have to lead from the front in terms of giving feedback, receiving feedback gracefully, and just seeing that as a very natural part of the job. So, for instance, at Farewill, my probation period was ended with actually like a 360 with the exec team, and so that was 3 months in. Like we're really getting into it and in-depth feedback together, and it was great because it makes I definitely love feedback and openness, so it makes me feel very comfortable and safe. But it also just allowed me to instantly get a good feel for what is the team thinking about, what are they seeing in me, what can I do to better support them, and so on, like
Mm.
really jogging the right kinds of questions. We also very early on created what we call the chart of accountabilities, which I know sounds probably kind of silly, but it was very helpful to be like, here are all the different like the different metrics and the
Is it like
things that each of
a
us.
Daisy racy type of thing, or?
It's literally just a chart of like the different like core metrics and things that matter to our business and who is like who where the buck stops on those things, if you will.
Yeah.
And that was really helpful because sometimes when we're having conversations where accountability will come into play, if we're not clear who was accountable, we can ask and then we update the chart and it just helps us be more efficient in the future. So that was also a really helpful thing, I think, for getting us moving together. Because I should also add a lot of the other execs on this team were new this year as well. And then I'd say from there, it's actually having those regular check ins. So I have weekly one to ones with all of the people in my first team, and we talk all the time. And we just have built the habit of you ask each other for feedback, you offer feedback. I think one of the things that we really benefit from is our CEO in particular is really great with like praise and positive feedback. And I think that's actually something we all have been guilty of probably not doing enough of in our careers. I certainly have. And so I think even just having that mechanism in place allows each of us to be constantly remembering, like, wow, actually, I should celebrate when my peer has done something great, and I shouldn't just be calling them up when they haven't done something well. And so that's been a very new thing for me in this environment. That so right now I'm really into the idea of like, how can we help people double down on strengths, not just how can we help call them up on the things that aren't as good. So beyond that, like lots of stuff around 360 systems and stuff, but I'll save all of those details for you all.
I love the chart of responsibility, Melissa, and it it looking at the same metrics and looking at the same dashboards is something that is hard, right? And not I've not always done it well. But if we're all looking at different data to drive our decisions, then no wonder we're going off on different paths, right? But bringing that data together and saying, hey, these are the metrics that matter, and aligning on that as a first team, and then looking at those on a regular basis will help us understand whether we're going in the right direction. So that's an interesting hack that you bring up, which is, well, whose name is against each metric? At least that's how I understood what you were explaining there. And I love that addition.
I think this actually ties into a good question here that Toby's asked us, which is, um, does first team actually need a leader? Can you build these mechanized systems where multiple people are holding each other accountable because they know who is responsible for certain parts of an operation? Or does the first team like need a clear, like the CEO is in charge, they're the buck stops with them on the decisions that we make? Or are you able to kind of democratize that a bit? I know there's like now we're getting into like now me starting to talk about wild stuff, but there's a lot of really interesting conversation in the people space right now about like workplace DAOs, for example, like really democratizing decision making within the business. And I think this kind of constant push towards a more entrepreneurial way of working, more AI, we're going to have more freelancers and people that are maybe fractional working across multiple businesses. I think we're going to have to start really thinking about this idea of like maybe there's no clear leaders in a lot of teams and things start to become much more democratized. How do you build that into your first team? Can it even work? Do you need to have a leader? Maya.
Yeah, I very much like the premise of kind of your framing here, and I will go back to my example of must-win battles at a venture level, right? So this is a very clear metric, very clear outcome that we need to drive, clear definitions of who and how is going to be able to contribute to deliver X, right? Very basic marketing example. If we need a revenue of X, is how much traffic, how much conversion, at what price, here's your final number, right? And so obviously different people will be able to influence different part of that journey, and they're all part of this one team. Now you might, name some ringleader in the CMO or anyone else so that they are kind of, the leader of that group for that specific deliverable. And it is their job to keep the rest of the team accountable and make sure that eventually everyone delivers X. But I think that's how you still provide some leadership and guidance and someone to turn to in the first instance, and something is not working out and you're not sure how to fix it, or someone to unlock, some budget conversation with others that you're stuck in. But at the core, it's this whole team is responsible, and we're not celebrating, the leader of that cross-functional group for that outcome. When things go well, we're celebrating everyone. And if it failed, well, the team failed at it, not a specific individual. Then, I'm sure Mel will have plenty of advice of how you figure out who maybe didn't pull as much weight and how do we handle that. But that's really, I think, where this cross-functional single unit and not, it's your problem kind of approach ends up coming through.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me a little bit like it's like a product squad, right? The team's almost operating like this kind of like split responsibility. Andy, this is well and truly into your world. Like, do you feel that there's like an analogy there? How do you think about that?
I considered going into the metaverse or talking about sociocracy. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about
Let's go anywhere.
about sociocracy here. So I also in my past life was an agile coach, and then I led a team of agile coaches, and we used to play around this concept of sociocracy 3.0, which talks about basically like teams that are based on consent, continuous improvement, equivalence, transparency, and accountability, where there isn't a clear leader, but actually there's clear forms of communication and ownership and accountability that we're always on the same page. The challenge in practice of why it was really difficult to implement was because teams are often at really different stages of maturity. And you're not often actually with the same team for the next 3 or 4 years. There's a state of flux of always changing in terms of people getting promoted, people leaving, people joining, to operate without a decision maker, which is why I think it would be really difficult with the fast growth nature of startups to not have a CEO or an ultimate person that's responsible for making that decision and being a conduit actually then with your board or a conduit then with your investors. Because again, that's a very different perspective that's really important into consideration when making certain decisions, because by taking on venture capital funding, inheriting a growth strategy, and you need to grow at a certain rate every year to meet the a requirement of that. So yeah, I've explored it, but I think it's very difficult in fast growing teams. I think it's very possible in teams that grow a bit slower, or organizations that are a bit smaller and more stable, or family run businesses or lifestyle businesses. But it's something that I'm very keen to explore more in understanding how at least certain aspects of it can be brought into our day-to-day work.
Yeah, I really like that. So
I
there's
think
kind
that
of this mindset of, sorry, Josh, go ahead. Go ahead. You cut in. I can always drift off onto another plane or dimension.
no apologies. I I think when things are going well, then groups will figure out ways to work with each other, right? And there was the holacracy trend of 10 years ago with GitHubs and others saying we don't need any managers. But the minute that shit hits the fan, you need somebody who can ultimately be accountable and bring everyone together. So I agree with where you're landing, Andy. On fast-moving startups, at the end of the day, you need that single, directly responsible individual of that team who's going to hold us all accountable. And you can only influence each other so much, and sometimes you just need to make a decision. And whether it's a
Mm.
disagree and commit culture or driving towards consensus, I think you ultimately need someone to be held accountable.
I think it's a really good addition. I think it kind of adds on perfectly there, which is that you, like everything in business, you take what you can and what works, and then you adapt it to make sure that you're able to make quick decisions and be efficient. Because ultimately, businesses aren't governments, right? They're businesses, they're instruments for gaining capital. So you do need to be able to make risky bets that maybe the whole team hasn't bought into, without the full picture, and that can be really difficult to do for a team. But implementing tools like accountability charts or DACY or RACY models or whatever it is that you're using to really drive home this kind of less hierarchical form of governance of decision making. So you don't need to have a CEO ultimately make the call every time. You can have other ways to make sure people know where to go when they want to make decisions together. Is that the kind of stuff you can implement on a small team? Sarah has asked us. They're a team of 3. They're SLT. She says they're really tight communicators. Should she start thinking about these ways of like democratizing decision making a little bit more and sharing and having visible accountability, or is that something that really comes a bit later when you're a bit more mature? How do we all think about it? Melissa, how are you thinking about it when you're building the team at Thread?
Well, just generally, I think whatever you do in those early days is what sets the tone for what's to come. And so this is why everyone talks about how important it is when you're hiring those first 10, 20, 50 people, and also how it's important to bring forward things like values and how we operate and just general ways of working into a much earlier phase than perhaps we used to think was right. And so I don't see any downside to starting to think about it now, especially if the 3 of you, I would guess, are probably going to, at least for the next tens of employees, be in quite critical leadership roles. So why wouldn't you want to figure out like how can we sort of divide and conquer together versus like let's have it be very like top down, like no one wants 1 to 1 to 1 or even just 1 to 2 in those days. Like let's figure out how we can collaborate. So I think that seems quite sensible.
Yeah, I really like that. So I think that the point there around like setting the tone, and you can always adapt and build on things, right? You can set up an MVP with maybe like 5 or 10 metrics on there, and eventually get to a place where you have 100. Whereby we have a similar thing. We've got about 200 metrics owned by different teams, but we're a bit further down the road. Okay, great. We're getting towards the end, and I want to make sure that we have one last kind of lightning round. One of the things I want to be here is we haven't got the voice of a CTO in this panel. This is, I think, probably one of the only panels that there's just no CTO. So I'm going to give them a bit of love. Engineering teams are often the biggest teams in a lot of startups, and our CTO usually has the pressure of having this really large organization under them when their other first leaders maybe have slightly less complexity, and that's definitely the truth up until about Series C. So that can be really difficult. I've got some great friends of mine who are CTOs and VPs of engineering, and I think that it's hard for us sometimes in other areas of the business to really fully understand how complex that kind of headspace is. So putting ourselves in their shoes and really trying to be empathetic with what they're going through, what's one kind of piece of advice or a common mistake you see, something that you just can have like an olive branch we can reach across the aisle now to all our CTOs listening, and try and help them out as they go on forth to manage and work with their first teams. We'll start with you, Andy, again.
Yeah, what came to mind immediately from my experiences working with technical talent across the ranks is just to communicate early and often and take people on a journey. I don't think the product person or the marketing person or any other person should be a translator. I think actually it's really important to develop those skills on how to always connect what you're doing to meaningful metrics. And the earlier you can do that on your career in leadership and in management, the better you're going to get at aligning and really understanding the interests of the organization. So I'd encourage all of the VPs and seniors in technical roles to just adopt that mindset of how can I communicate early and often to take people on the journey and speak the same so that they can really buy into what I'm doing and why.
Wonderful. Maya.
Yeah, I mean, building on that completely plus one this, I think that's essential. And we touched on that as well a bit through the conversation. The other thing I would say, and possibly apply slightly more to like earlier stage businesses that are growing fast, and possibly while the engineering team still has the most, the largest team, they're also just really short on talent or diversity of talent and things like that.
Mm,
It's just really taking the time, kind of the cross-functional team, I think, does the best they can in writing the right Jira ticket or being precise on their requirements and all of that. But let's be honest, we haven't been brought up with that in our skill set, and we learn as our engineering team teaches
mm,
us. Or really, if we have someone in the engineering team that kind of takes us through the hands and saying, so what you mean really is XYZ. And I can very much relate to that because, I'll sit with product people and saying, what you mean is that feature ABC really allows you to, XYZ, right? So translating that is really important, and really taking the time to saying, you know what? Okay, what is it that you need? 15 minutes. Is it this version or that version? Well, how about this? Okay, add it here when it's ready, and then we'll talk again. And so really being a bit more of that guide sometimes, because you end up in this whole like, it's a really badly written ticket. And I'm like, I don't know what to do with it. And you're just, and people are just stuck. So really being a guide, just like, I wouldn't expect my CTO to be building amazingly converting Facebook ads, like, so that's kind of just being really supportive of each other. And sometimes a 5-minute quick conversation just unlocks everything.
And I find that's most important when talking about technical debt. Right? Nobody wants to work in an environment where we slow down so much that we can't get new features developed, but it can be very hard sometimes for a non-technical peer to understand the trade-offs of building new features versus paying down that debt. So, building on what Andy was saying, the more that you as a technical leader can explain the why behind needing to prioritize paying down that debt and help the rest of us understand those business trade-offs, then the easier those conversations are going to be.
Yeah, what I would add in from the people perspective is to not make it a transactional relationship. I can promise you that you and your people leader are going to have similar goals, and you should put them on the table right away, which is you both are going to want to build the best team possible. You're both going to want that engineering team to do amazing things. Like all of that is going to be true. And so the sooner you can start having more meaningful conversations, like tell me all the stuff that you think I don't even necessarily want to know because I do want to know it. Like it's not just task, task, task. It's like, let's actually get down to what are we both here to do? And let's go as deep as we have to, and let's do it together.
I love that. What just a lovely buffet of really thoughtful, caring advice from everyone here. And I love that it kind of fed through. Be very opinionated. Make sure you're using that opinion across the entire business and understanding how to translate to different parts of the team. Being very empathetic with what they're going through and understanding how to communicate with them together can be a challenge you need to overcome in duality. And then the final thing is we all have the same goals, right? We're all trying to work towards the same thing, and keeping that in mind is often difficult to do when you're under a lot of pressure and you have a big team around you who have lots of priorities. We have just about run out of time. We've got about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to quickly wrap up and say thank you so much for everyone. Thank you again for the lovely questions that we had. We had some really interesting questions. We got to everyone, but if there's anything you haven't asked and you've thought of something or you want to get out to one of us personally, you can reach out to us on Twitter. The CTO Craft team will be sharing our Twitter and our LinkedIn links. And also, of course, on the CTO Craft Slack group, which I think we should all be on there now, ready to do some AMAs later on. But feel free to reach out directly and ask us anything. And again, a massive thanks to Maya, Josh, Andy, and Melissa. It's been so nice chatting to you all and getting to know you a little bit more. Really looking forward to catching up with you again very soon. Thanks so much, everyone.